It was one of those late summer mornings when the air hung heavy, and the only sounds were distant traffic and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Nate Washington, a man in his early 40s with a calm demeanor and piercing gaze, locked his car and paused for a moment to soak in the familiar yet hostile environment. He just moved to this quiet suburban neighborhood, hoping for a fresh start and a peaceful life. But as Nate scanned the surroundings, he could feel the eyes on him, whispers drifting in his direction, subtle yet pointed stares, as if he didn't belong. Nate stood tall with broad shoulders and a presence that exuded confidence. He wore his usual attire, a crisp white shirt with his favorite dark blazer over his shoulder, the telltale sign of a professional. Despite his polished appearance and calm expression, Nate wasn't oblivious. Years of quietly navigating spaces where he was often the only black face had made him adept at reading the room. And this room, the neighborhood, was already proving to be filled with hostility hidden beneath smiles and polite small talk. As he walked up the driveway to his new home, Nate noticed his next-door neighbor, Mr. Hendricks, standing on his perfectly manicured lawn, watching him intently. Mr. Hendricks was the type who took pride in appearances, with an immaculately trimmed lawn and a flagpole out front, flying the flag of his alma mater. Nate offered him a friendly nod and a "Good morning." Hendricks, a man in his late 60s with graying hair and a smug air, looked Nate up and down before giving a curt nod in return, his lips pressed into a thin line. The interaction was brief, but Nate could feel the disdain simmering beneath Hendricks' gaze, a subtle reminder that, to some, he was still an outsider here. Everyday life became a balancing act. Nate quickly realized that despite his professional background, his polished mannerisms, and his calm demeanor, he was seen as a problem. The subtle glances turned into hushed whispers whenever he entered the local grocery store. Neighbors began to keep their children away from his side of the street. Nate could feel their eyes following him, always watching, waiting for a mistake, something to confirm their preconceived notions about him. At first, he tried to brush it off, convincing himself that he was overthinking things. After all, he dealt with worse in his life: harsh words, sneers, and even outright prejudice. He was no stranger to these experiences. But here, in a place he was supposed to call home, it stung deeper. The whispered conversations he caught only hinted at the narrow-mindedness of some of his neighbors, and Hendricks was at the center of it all. In the quiet of his new home, Nate allowed himself to reflect. He had been through years of education, countless struggles and hurdles, working his way to a position he was proud of. Each trial had strengthened him, shaped him, and made him the man he was today. But Hendricks and his cronies knew nothing of that. All they saw was an outsider who didn't belong. Nate's resolve began to harden. Every slight glance, every avoided eye contact only fueled his determination to stay. This house, this neighborhood, he had earned his place here just like anyone else. He thought of his young son, who would visit on weekends, and his heart ached at the thought of him witnessing or understanding the quiet animosity that Nate now felt. "I'm staying," he told himself. "I'm staying, not just for me, but for him." One evening, Nate decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to make himself visible, to show the people around him that he wasn't intimidated by their silent hostility. As he made his way down the street, he noticed Hendricks watching him from his driveway, arms crossed and expression tight with disapproval. Nate met his gaze with a steady stare and continued on his way, refusing to shrink under Hendricks' scrutiny. But in that brief moment, he could see a flicker of anger in the older man's eyes. It was more than just dislike, there was something vindictive lurking there. Hendricks made sure that Nate understood he was unwelcome. The subtle actions soon turned into something more overt. Nate woke up one morning to find his car scratched from front to back. Long, angry lines carved into the paint. He clenched his jaw, suppressing the rush of frustration and anger bubbling up within him. It was an unmistakable message, a warning that his presence wasn't wanted here. But Nate wasn't about to be scared off. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Not this time." As he stood beside his damaged car, Nate couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. It wasn't just about the vandalism. It was a personal attack, a violation meant to strip away his dignity, to make him feel less than. And while he could handle the superficial damage, the message behind it struck deeper. He spent a long moment in silence, his mind racing through the years he had fought to build his life. All the sacrifices, all the hard work to reach where he was now, were challenged in an instant by someone who believed he could decide who belonged and who didn't. He thought about calling the police, about raising an issue with the community board, but he knew how these things usually played out. He'd seen it before, the subtle dismissal, the lack of action. But this time, he wouldn't just let it go. He would address it head-on, in a way that left no question about his strength and resolve. In the days that followed the vandalism incident, Nate tried to return to a sense of normalcy, but Mr. Hendricks' presence felt like a storm cloud hovering over every quiet morning and evening. Hendricks wasn't just a man with a grudge. He had a way of projecting his authority as though he were the self-appointed gatekeeper of the neighborhood, wielding his influence through whispered remarks and an unspoken air of superiority. He had lived here for decades and seemed to take pride in keeping the character of the neighborhood intact, as he often put it, though it was clear what that character truly meant. One afternoon, as Nate was pulling into his driveway, he saw Hendricks standing at the edge of his lawn, talking to a small group of neighbors. They laughed in low, hushed tones, their eyes flicking towards Nate as he got out of his car. Hendricks' face twisted with a mocking smile. His expression alone conveyed a lifetime of unchecked prejudice, a thinly veiled disdain he wore like a badge of honor. Ignoring the looks, Nate kept his focus on gathering his things from the car, fighting the irritation that bubbled up with each passing second. But Hendricks wouldn't let him pass without a word. He called out in a loud, theatrical tone, as if he were addressing the whole street. "Ah, Mr. Washington!" Hendricks sneered, his voice dripping with a mocking friendliness. "Settling in well, I hope?" Nate straightened, taking a measured breath before responding with a polite nod. "Doing just fine, thank you." Hendricks took a few steps closer, his gaze sweeping over Nate's car with a feigned look of pity. "Shame about the, scratches," he said, not even trying to conceal the satisfaction in his voice. "This neighborhood has always been a bit selective with the type it welcomes, you know?" Nate could feel the anger rise within him, but he kept his expression calm, meeting Hendricks' gaze steadily. "Yes, I've noticed," he replied, his tone firm yet restrained. This response seemed to irritate Hendricks, who narrowed his eyes. He had expected Nate to falter, to respond with some nervous deference. Instead, Nate's calm defiance challenged him, undermining his assumed authority. Hendricks wasn't accustomed to being met with anything less than submission, and he wasn't about to let that change now. "You know, Nate," Hendricks said, his voice dropping into a low, condescending tone, "people in this neighborhood are proud of its, let's say, consistent quality. We don't see much value in folks bringing in, well, unfamiliar ways." He smirked as he glanced back at the group of neighbors behind him, who nodded in agreement, creating a united front of silent judgment. Nate felt the words hit him like a slap, but he held his ground. He knew men like Hendricks thrived on intimidation and the belief that their narrow perspectives were shared by everyone around them. It was a language he had learned to recognize and refuse to let under his skin. "I'd think diversity would be a strength," Nate said simply, his gaze unflinching. "Especially in a place as nice as this." His response caught the neighbors off guard, and a few exchanged glances as if unsure whether they should laugh, agree, or remain silent. Hendricks' smug expression faltered, but he quickly regained his composure, giving Nate a thin, menacing smile. "I suppose we'll see how long that lasts," Hendricks replied, his words laced with a quiet threat. "People have ways of making things uncomfortable for those who disrupt the order." He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air, hoping to chip away at Nate's confidence. Nate nodded, refusing to break eye contact. "I've faced worse." This was too much for Hendricks. The older man bristled, clenching his jaw as he struggled to maintain his cool facade. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a last attempt to assert dominance. "Just remember," he said coldly, "people know how to make things happen around here, things that don't necessarily get resolved." Nate's fists clenched at his sides, but he took a steadying breath, reminding himself of all he had worked for, everything he had achieved. This man was beneath him, and Nate knew it. He was done with bowing his head, done with shrinking himself to make others feel comfortable. He gave Hendricks one last steady look before walking inside, not dignifying his threats with any further response. Behind the door, Nate took a few deep breaths, allowing the frustration to ebb away as he stood in the solitude of his home. There was a time, not long ago, when such an interaction would have shaken him to the core, made him question himself or his place. But now, it only strengthened his resolve. He thought of the young associates he mentored at the courthouse, of his son who looked up to him, of every person who had believed in him along the way. No, he wouldn't let a man like Hendricks dictate his life. The following days only intensified Hendricks' efforts to make Nate's life miserable. He would stand at his window, watching Nate's every move, or, accidentally, leave his garbage bin tipped over near Nate's driveway. Neighbors who once offered polite smiles began to avoid eye contact, conversations cut short or hushed when Nate walked by. Hendricks had a quiet but effective influence over them, using his years of familiarity and reputation to shape their view of Nate before they even had a chance to know him. One evening, as Nate was about to head out for a walk, he noticed Hendricks standing by his car again, this time accompanied by a couple of men Nate hadn't seen before. Hendricks pointed at Nate's house, his voice loud and authoritative. "This one here. You'd think some people would get the hint, but no, they have to force themselves into places they clearly don't belong." The men chuckled, and Hendricks turned to Nate, his eyes full of smug satisfaction. "Oh, Mr. Washington," he called out, pretending to be surprised. "Didn't see you there. I was just telling my friends here how hard it is to keep certain standards in our lovely neighborhood." Nate stopped in his tracks, his face calm but his heart racing. He could feel the hostility radiating off Hendricks and his companions, their laughter thick with condescension. But rather than giving in to anger, Nate took a slow, measured breath, responding with a simple, "Evening, Mr. Hendricks." The indifferent tone threw Hendricks off balance, and for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty passed across his face. But he quickly recovered, laughing as though he found Nate's stoicism amusing. "You must be used to this sort of adversity," he sneered, emphasizing the word as if it were a slur. Nate simply smiled, looking Hendricks in the eye. "You'd be surprised at what I'm used to." The men laughed again, but this time, their laughter felt hollow. Nate turned and continued on his walk, letting his measured steps speak volumes. He refused to give Hendricks the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, his restrained but unyielding strength only made Hendricks more determined to provoke a reaction, to see Nate falter. When Nate returned home that night, he sat in silence, reflecting on the chain of events. Every encounter had pushed him closer to the edge, but not once had he allowed his anger to cloud his judgment. He had spent years building himself up, enduring far worse situations, facing far more powerful adversaries, and yet, the sting of discrimination never seemed to fade. But this time, he would be the one in control of how this story ended. With quiet determination, Nate set his mind to what lay ahead. He wouldn't let Hendricks or anyone else make him feel small. In the end, he'd reveal who he truly was, and Hendricks would learn that appearances could be deceiving. Over the following weeks, the neighborhood tensions simmered, with Hendricks continuously pushing the boundaries of Nate's patience. Despite the hostility, Nate responded with an almost unshakable calm, which only served to further aggravate Hendricks. Each encounter became a test of wills, with Hendricks upping the ante, hoping to provoke a reaction from Nate that would confirm his own biases. But Nate, having faced countless courtroom battles and experienced a life's worth of prejudice, knew how to stay steady under pressure. The first hint of Nate's hidden strength appeared in an unexpected form. As he left for work one morning, he ran into a young man outside his house, waiting with an eager smile. "Mr. Washington?" the young man asked, extending his hand. "It's an honor, sir. I'm Stephen, one of your former law students. I just passed the bar, thanks to your advice during that lecture. Changed my whole approach." The young man was beaming, gratitude written all over his face. Nate smiled, shaking his hand firmly. "That's wonderful news, Stephen. I'm glad to hear it," he said, his tone warm. They spoke for a few minutes, with Stephen expressing his excitement about starting his career in law and thanking Nate profusely for his guidance. Hendricks watched from his porch, eyebrows knitting together in confusion. Law students? Lectures? He hadn't considered that Nate might be more than what he assumed. He told himself it was a one-off, a coincidence, but something about it left him unsettled. However, his uncertainty only deepened his resolve to assert control. Later that week, Hendricks found another opportunity to escalate his treatment of Nate. It was trash collection day, and he spotted Nate rolling his bin out to the curb. Hendricks seized the moment, calling out to him with a smug tone. "You know, Mr. Washington, we have rules about how early bins can be put out. Not that you'd understand," he added, voice dripping with condescension. Nate turned to him, pausing for a moment before responding with measured patience. "It's out within the scheduled time, Mr. Hendricks," he replied calmly, his eyes meeting Hendricks without a hint of intimidation. Hendricks sneered, his voice louder now for the benefit of other neighbors within earshot. "We take pride in following rules around here. You people always seem to have trouble with that." Nate's jaw tightened, but he remained composed, choosing his words carefully. "I'm well aware of the rules and I follow them," he said. His calm gaze was unwavering, and he did not move or flinch, even as the intensity of Hendricks' hostility grew. With nothing more to say, Nate turned and walked back inside, leaving Hendricks seething at his refusal to be drawn into an argument. The following weekend, Hendricks decided to take things a step further. He organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss the quality and standards of the area, clearly intending to rally others against Nate. When Nate arrived home that evening, he noticed the group of neighbors gathered on Hendricks' lawn, their heads turning his way as Hendricks spoke in low, conspiratorial tones. Nate wasn't naive. He could tell that his presence was the subject of the discussion. As Nate walked past, he could hear Hendricks speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear, his words laced with venom. "Some people just don't respect tradition. They come in, thinking they can do whatever they please, change the neighborhood's character, bring in their different ways." But Nate held his head high, refusing to let Hendricks' words goad him. He knew how to pick his battles, and he wasn't about to be baited into one that would only feed Hendricks' narrative. As he passed the group, he gave a polite nod, which seemed to infuriate Hendricks even more. "Just so you know, we're not going to let people lower the standards of this neighborhood," Hendricks shouted after him, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You can't just walk in here and act like you own the place." Without turning, Nate called back, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I came here to live peacefully, just like everyone else." The words were simple, yet delivered with such quiet strength that they seemed to hang in the air, a calm counter to Hendricks' hostility. But Hendricks wasn't satisfied. One morning, as Nate was stepping out of his car, Hendricks approached him with a new accusation. "Mr. Washington, we've noticed an uptick in certain activities since you moved in," he said, folding his arms and looking at Nate with a smug expression. Nate raised an eyebrow, his patience wearing thin. "What exactly are you referring to, Mr. Hendricks?" "Oh, you know," Hendricks said, waving his hand dismissively. "I've seen some unfamiliar faces around here lately. People who don't really fit the community standards." Nate knew exactly what Hendricks was insinuating, but he kept his response controlled. "Those unfamiliar faces are friends and colleagues. People like the young lawyer who thanked me for his career the other day," he said, his gaze steady. "And if anyone has an issue with that, they're welcome to speak to me directly." This revelation seemed to catch Hendricks off guard, if only for a second, before he regained his composure. He was starting to realize that Nate was not someone who would be easily intimidated, but he refused to back down. As Nate walked away, Hendricks muttered to himself, "We'll see how long you can keep this up." With each encounter, Nate's quiet resilience only added to Hendricks' frustration, and the tension between them continued to build. The neighbors started to notice the ongoing friction, their curiosity growing as they watched Hendricks repeatedly try, and fail, to get under Nate's skin. Nate's calm responses, his unwillingness to react, left a sense of mystery around him, prompting some neighbors to question Hendricks' relentless attitude. One afternoon, as Nate returned from work, he saw a small envelope tucked under his door. He opened it to find a letter from a prominent law firm he had worked with in the past, thanking him for his invaluable assistance on a recent case. It was a reminder of the connections and respect he commanded in his professional life, something that Hendricks would never suspect. Nate couldn't help but smile, imagining the reaction Hendricks would have if he knew the truth. But he kept it to himself, choosing not to reveal his background or accomplishments just yet. He knew that his strength lay in patience and precision, in not showing his hand until the right moment. Hendricks' prejudice blinded him to the depth of Nate's character, and Nate intended to use that to his advantage. In the days that followed, Hendricks intensified his efforts, each encounter escalating in its hostility. He left anonymous notes on Nate's doorstep, filled with thinly veiled threats and racial slurs, hoping to provoke him. But Nate remained composed, his mind focused on a bigger picture. He knew that revealing his true power at the right time would be far more effective than responding to petty provocations. One evening, as Nate walked past Hendricks' house, he overheard a conversation that hinted at another level of Hendricks' influence. The older man was speaking to a local city council member, casually mentioning concerns about new arrivals in the neighborhood and suggesting that certain people might not respect the area's values. Nate knew what Hendricks was trying to do. He was trying to leverage his connections to pressure Nate into leaving. But rather than feeling threatened, Nate felt a renewed sense of determination. He knew that this was Hendricks' last attempt to assert control, to use whatever influence he had left to drive Nate out. What Hendricks didn't realize was that Nate had connections too, ones that could dismantle his influence with a single phone call if necessary. As he continued his walk that evening, Nate's mind was racing, not with fear or anger, but with a sense of clarity. Hendricks' attempts to intimidate him had only revealed his own weakness, a reliance on prejudice and superficial power. In the face of Nate's silent strength, that power was nothing. For now, Nate kept his knowledge and connections to himself, letting the suspense build. He knew that, in time, the truth would come out, and Hendricks would be left stunned. The stage was set, and all he needed to do was wait for the perfect moment to reveal who he truly was. It was a rainy Thursday evening when Nate found himself at a community event he'd nearly skipped. The city was holding a charity gala, and despite the persistent hostility from Hendricks, Nate knew this would be an opportunity to make a statement. He arrived at the event in a sleek suit, calm and composed, blending easily with the crowd. As he walked into the grand hall, his demeanor shifted ever so slightly. Here, surrounded by city officials and other influential figures, he was in his element. Many guests recognized him, their smiles and nods signaling a level of respect that went beyond neighborhood interactions. It was a refreshing change from the cold stares he'd been met with from his neighbors. As he made his way around, he exchanged a few words with familiar faces, people he'd encountered through his work in the justice system or in past cases. Those who knew him understood the quiet authority he commanded, and for a moment, Nate allowed himself to enjoy the camaraderie. Unbeknownst to him, Hendricks was also at the event, speaking with an acquaintance when he noticed Nate across the room. His brow furrowed in annoyance. What was he doing here? Hendricks approached, his voice laced with the same condescension Nate had come to expect. I didn't expect to see you here, Washington, Hendricks sneered. This is more of a community event. Guess they're letting anyone in these days. Nate looked him in the eye, a faint smile on his lips. I'm here as a guest of honor, actually. I was invited by the city council, he replied calmly, his words landing with quiet force. Hendricks' smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly, rolling his eyes. Must be some kind of quota, Hendricks muttered under his breath, though loud enough for those around them to hear. Nate noted the shocked expressions of a few nearby attendees, but he didn't respond to Hendricks' bait. He maintained his composure, even as he felt the urge to finally address the blatant disrespect. A woman nearby overheard and shook her head, stepping forward with a polite smile. Judge Washington has done a lot for this city. I imagine we're lucky he even made time to attend tonight, she said, her tone dripping with subtle reproach as she turned her back on Hendricks and engaged Nate in conversation. This small show of support strengthened Nate's resolve, and as the night went on, he found himself subtly asserting his presence, moving confidently through the room and speaking with people who clearly respected his contributions. By the end of the evening, Hendricks was left fuming, unable to reconcile the authority and respect Nate commanded in this setting. For the first time, Hendricks found himself in Nate's shadow, an uncomfortable realization that he couldn't shake. The following morning, however, Hendricks doubled down on his vendetta. He made a point of approaching Nate as he brought in his trash cans, sneering as he muttered, "Funny how a few people are fooled by a slick suit and a little talk. You'll never fit in here, no matter who you think you are." Nate stopped, turning to face him, a quiet determination in his eyes. "You know, Mr. Hendricks," he said slowly, "I've dealt with much more challenging situations than living in a neighborhood with one disrespectful neighbor. You might be determined to make things difficult for me, but it won't change who I am or what I stand for." "Who you are?" Hendricks scoffed. "I know exactly who you are." Nate's gaze hardened. He could have revealed his credentials then, his long career as a judge, his influence, his respect in the city. But he held back, recognizing the power of timing. He chose to remain silent, standing tall in the face of Hendricks' contempt. Each word he spoke was steady, unwavering, a quiet show of resilience that rattled Hendricks more than any retort. From that moment on, Nate's strength was evident in his restraint. Neighbors began to notice how calmly he withstood Hendricks' continued provocations, and whispers spread about Hendricks' excessive behavior. As the days passed, Nate focused on his work and his home, leaving Hendricks to stew in his own frustration. Hendricks tried everything, leaving petty complaints with the Homeowners Association, reporting trivial matters to local authorities, but each time, he came up short. One Saturday morning, Nate received a call from a former law clerk, who reminded him of an upcoming awards ceremony at which he would be recognized for his service to the city. It was a prestigious event, one that would bring together members of the judiciary, city officials, and prominent community leaders. The timing couldn't have been better, and Nate knew that this was the moment to set things straight. When the day of the awards ceremony arrived, Nate invited a few of his neighbors to attend, including those who had been wary or distant due to Hendricks' influence. As they gathered, many saw a different side of Nate. Here, he was not merely the new neighbor, but a man respected and celebrated by city officials and professionals alike. As he received his award, Nate took a moment to reflect, his words filled with humility and wisdom as he addressed the audience. "I am honored to serve a city that believes in justice, respect, and community. It's easy to judge others by what's on the surface, but true strength is found in patience and integrity. As he spoke, Hendrik's face turned pale, realizing the depth of Nate's influence and respect. The neighbors who had been watching him curiously in recent weeks now looked at him with admiration. They saw him not as someone who didn't belong, but as a man who had stood firm in the face of baseless judgment and petty hostility. Nate's quiet resilience under pressure had not only revealed his true character, but had also exposed Hendrik's pettiness. The turning point was complete. Hendrik's power over the neighborhood was broken, and Nate had won the respect of his community without a single act of retaliation. It was a victory that resonated beyond words, a testament to the strength that comes from standing tall against adversity. As Nate walked back to his seat, the audience applauded, many of them moved by his words. Hendrik sat silently, feeling the weight of his own small-mindedness, finally understanding that he had misjudged Nate from the very beginning. The morning after the awards ceremony, a wave of change swept through the neighborhood. Word of Nate's recognition had spread quickly, and for the first time, people seemed to look at him differently. Neighbors who once cast hesitant glances now offered warm smiles and friendly nods, and a few even approached him for brief, respectful conversations. Hendricks, on the other hand, had been conspicuously absent since the event. His frustration, once bubbling under a facade of smug confidence, had begun to seep into the cracks of his carefully controlled demeanor. Hendricks had always prided himself on knowing exactly who everyone in the neighborhood was, but now, he was unsettled. Nate was not just another new resident he could intimidate and control. He was a man of influence, a respected judge, whose presence could shift the very dynamics of the community. Hendricks stewed in his growing discomfort, pacing his living room as he tried to piece together how he had misjudged Nate so completely. Later that week, Hendricks found himself reluctantly attending a community meeting in the local hall. To his dismay, Nate was also there, seated comfortably at the front, his relaxed demeanor exuding quiet authority. Hendricks clenched his jaw, eyeing Nate with a mixture of anger and unease. He could no longer brush Nate aside as easily as before, and the realization gnawed at him. As the meeting progressed, the community's discussion turned to an ongoing dispute about property lines and regulations that had caused tension among neighbors for months. The Homeowners Association had been unable to reach a resolution, with Hendricks often using his influence to sway opinions in his favor. This time, however, as the committee struggled to agree, several members turned toward Nate, seeking his advice. "Nate," one of the board members said, "you have experience with legal matters, right? Do you think you could help us interpret these bylaws?" Nate hesitated briefly, then nodded, rising from his seat. He addressed the room with the same measured tone he used in court, effortlessly analyzing the situation and explaining the legal implications of the property lines in question. His insights were clear, precise, and fair, leaving no room for ambiguity. Hendricks' jaw tightened as he watched the neighbors around him nodding in agreement, their respect for Nate evident. But the real moment of reckoning came when one of the neighbors, a retired attorney who had known Nate from the city's legal circles, spoke up. "For those who may not know, Judge Washington here has spent years serving this city with integrity. I've seen him handle some of the toughest cases with a calm wisdom that's rare these days. We're lucky to have someone of his stature in our community." At the mention of Judge Washington, an audible gasp rippled through the room. Some neighbors exchanged surprised glances, while others looked at Nate with newfound admiration. Hendricks sat frozen in his seat, his eyes wide with shock as the full weight of the revelation sank in. Judge. Not just a well-spoken newcomer, but a judge. His adversary was a man whose influence reached far beyond the neighborhood, a man who could sway the law itself. The power shift was palpable, and Hendricks could feel it in every gaze directed at him. The smug confidence he once wielded had evaporated, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. His face flushed as he realized how out of his depth he truly was. As the meeting adjourned, Hendricks found himself cornered in his own discomfort. He could feel Nate's presence nearby, calm and unbothered, surrounded by neighbors eager to speak with him. Hendrik's world had turned on its axis, and he was no longer at the center. Everything he had worked to cultivate, his authority, his control, his reputation, now paled in comparison to the quiet, unwavering strength Nate commanded. Unable to suppress his bitterness, Hendricks approached Nate as he was leaving, his voice low and laced with desperation. "So you're a judge," he muttered, forcing a tight, insincere smile. "Quite a surprise. You didn't think to mention that?" Nate regarded him calmly, his expression unreadable. "I didn't think it was necessary," he replied, his tone polite yet firm. "I came here to be part of this community, just like anyone else." Hendricks scoffed, struggling to maintain his composure. "You know, some people might think you were hiding it on purpose. Maybe even playing a game." Nate tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Hiding who I am? I've always been straightforward, Hendricks. I simply chose not to lead with my title because I believe respect is earned by actions, not words." Hendricks opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. The subtle reprimand in Nate's words hit him harder than he anticipated. Nate had not only outmaneuvered him but had done so with dignity, a quiet strength that underscored the pettiness of Hendricks' actions. Realizing he had no counter, Hendricks turned on his heel and left, his face flushed with humiliation. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and he could no longer assert dominance over Nate, or the neighborhood. In Nate's composed, dignified presence, Hendricks was forced to confront the limitations of his own authority, an authority that had crumbled in the face of true respect and quiet resilience. As Nate walked home that evening, he could feel a sense of peace settling over him. The revelation of his position as a judge had shifted perceptions in the neighborhood, but more than that, it had allowed him to reclaim a sense of belonging. He had not needed to raise his voice or retaliate. His presence, his integrity, had spoken for itself. The respect he had earned was genuine, built on a foundation of resilience that no amount of hostility could erode. In the days that followed, Hendricks' presence in the neighborhood diminished. No longer the figure of authority he once imagined himself to be, he began avoiding community events and gatherings. His influence had waned, his reputation irreparably damaged by his own hubris. Meanwhile, Nate found himself embraced by the community, his quiet strength and humility leaving a lasting impression. He had shown his neighbors that integrity could withstand the strongest of storms, and that respect was a far more enduring source of power than any title or position. In the end, the big reveal had not just reshaped Hendricks' perception but had solidified Nate's place in the neighborhood. He was no longer the new neighbor, or the outsider. He was Judge Washington, a man who had earned the respect of his community not through intimidation, but through patience, resilience, and an unwavering sense of justice. In the weeks that followed the big reveal, Hendricks' world began to crumble in ways he had never anticipated. His standing within the neighborhood, the influence he had held over community matters, waned rapidly. The neighbors, now aware of his unfair treatment toward Nate, viewed him with a mixture of disappointment and distaste. Those who once sided with him now saw his hostility in a new light, realizing it had been rooted in prejudice rather than genuine concern for the community. Hendricks' once frequent interactions with his neighbors became increasingly strained. People who once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact, their conversations drying up into polite nods or hurried exchanges. The invitations to gatherings he once took for granted disappeared. He found himself excluded, a pariah in a community he'd controlled for so long. Professionally, the effects were equally devastating. Hendricks had prided himself on his connections, often boasting of his ties to local officials. But when word of his actions reached some of his colleagues, they took a step back, unwilling to be associated with someone whose actions showed such a clear lack of integrity. His behavior became a topic of quiet discussion in professional circles, and his reputation took a sharp downturn. Contracts he was sure he'd land slipped away, opportunities dried up, and his influence shrank further with each passing day. Meanwhile, Nate continued to settle into his life in the neighborhood, greeted with respect and appreciation by those around him. In quiet ways, he helped guide the community on legal and social matters, always ensuring fairness and balance. He had become someone people turned to for advice, not out of obligation but out of genuine trust in his wisdom and character. One afternoon, at a neighborhood gathering, an elderly neighbor approached Nate with a warm smile. "Judge Washington," she said, her voice full of gratitude, "it's such a relief to have someone here who believes in fairness and justice. You've brought a sense of balance to this community that we never realized we were missing." Nate returned her smile, his heart warmed by the acknowledgement. He had never intended to play such a prominent role, but he was glad to know his presence had made a difference. The quiet victory was sweeter than any public recognition or award. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his values, resilience, integrity, and kindness, had triumphed over prejudice and arrogance. For Hendricks, however, the weight of his own actions bore down on him with increasing intensity. As he walked through the neighborhood, he could feel the cold stares, the quiet judgments that followed him. There was no room left for him to twist the narrative or shift the blame. The truth of his actions was plain to see. He had once held control over the neighborhood's dynamics, but his behavior had left him isolated and unwelcome, the respect he once commanded now a distant memory. Desperate to restore some semblance of normalcy, Hendricks tried approaching Nate during one of his evening walks, hoping to find some way to clear the air. "Nate, listen," he began, his voice low, almost pleading. "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. Maybe we can put this behind us." Nate regarded him thoughtfully, his expression calm but unyielding. "Hendricks," he replied, his tone measured, "I have no ill will toward you. But respect and trust aren't things that can be restored overnight. They're built through actions. I hope, for your sake, that you can find a way to be the neighbor this community deserves." Hendricks' face fell, and he nodded slowly, realizing that there was no easy path to redemption. Nate's words were a reminder of the opportunity he had squandered, and the responsibility he had failed to uphold. In the days that followed, Hendricks kept a low profile, trying to avoid the gaze of his neighbors. The consequences of his actions served as a reminder that power gained through intimidation was fleeting, while true respect, earned through fairness and integrity, was enduring. Nate, on the other hand, embraced his place in the community. He found himself invited to gatherings and discussions, his neighbors eager to include him and benefit from his insights. Children in the neighborhood, who had once watched him with curiosity, now waved at him as he passed by, their parents smiling and nodding in approval. One evening, as Nate sat on his porch, he took a moment to reflect on everything that had transpired. Moving into this neighborhood had been a decision filled with apprehension, a step into the unknown. He had known the risks, understood that not everyone would welcome him. But he had chosen to trust in himself, to rely on the principles that had guided him throughout his life. And in the end, those principles had seen him through. He realized that the experience had strengthened him, reaffirming his belief in resilience and the quiet power of integrity. He had faced prejudice and overcome it, not through retaliation, but by staying true to himself. It was a lesson that echoed through every case he had ever presided over, every challenge he had ever faced, that strength was not about domination, but about standing firm in one's values, no matter the opposition. As the evening sky darkened and stars began to emerge, Nate felt a deep sense of peace. He had found his place here, not by force, but by letting his actions speak louder than words. The respect he had earned was genuine, and the sense of belonging he felt was profound. He had stood up against prejudice and won, not through confrontation, but through quiet, unwavering resolve. In that moment, Nate knew that he would continue to live by these values, knowing they would guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead. The neighborhood had become more than just a place to live. It was a community he had helped shape, a space where respect and fairness could thrive. His final reflection was one of gratitude, for the strength to endure, for the wisdom to remain patient, and for the resilience to emerge stronger. Nate knew that his journey was far from over, but he also knew that, no matter what came next, he would face it with the same integrity and courage that had brought him here. As he looked out over the neighborhood, a slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. He had won, not through force or influence, but through resilience, integrity, and the power of perseverance. And in the end, that quiet victory was more rewarding than any title or accolade could ever be.